Hi, I'm Andrew McCrae. Welcome to our farm and ranch in northwest Missouri. My great-great-grandfather settled here in 1910, and I'm the fifth generation to grow crops and livestock here. As a farmer myself, I know the highs and lows of this life, the issues we confront every day, some new, some as old as farming itself. This show is a place to talk with farmers and others in the ag industry about topics that mean something to us, topics that can improve the present and future of our operations. This is Farming the Countryside. Welcome to Farming the Countryside. My guest this week, Eric Bailey, and we're going to be talking about beef nutrition, not only forages, but also perhaps talking about some of this extra corn maybe some of us have with a big bumper crop and low prices out there. As we get started with this broadcast, I want to remind you that Farming the Countryside is brought to you by Pro Farmer. Every marketing decision you make for your farm can have a major impact on your bottom line. Pro Farmer understands this and provides unbiased market analysis and news to help you make on-time, informed decisions, protect profits, and manage your risk. No market alone. Experience the difference Pro Farmer can make in your marketing decisions. Learn more at profarmer.com. Well, let's jump into our conversation. And Eric Bailey is Associate Professor and State Beef Nutrition Specialist at the University of Missouri. And even though both of us happen to live in Missouri, we're going to be talking broader than Missouri here. Eric, you and I have visited, although it's been a while since you've been on here, not because I don't want to have you on, but because I wanted to save up here and talk to you as we're heading into fall, especially about forage. This is something that I think about here on our own farm. But I think when I originally connected with you, you had written something about basically you don't need hay to raise cattle. And I think that raised some eyebrows. And I know that when we've talked before, you're certainly not saying you can't feed hay to cattle. Hay can have an important part. But maybe I might start there and just let you to begin to talk about, as beef producers do, we need to be thinking beyond hay. And if we're going to do that, how do we begin to look at our forages perhaps in a little different way?
Well, Andrew, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today, and I'm grateful that we're getting to have this conversation. And I'm just going to start off with a quip. If the answer to the question you seek is hay, you're asking the wrong question. I believe that today just as strongly as I did back when we first spoke about that. And the reason for that is it's very simple. It's costly. It's 2 to 3 times the price of a cow grazing the feed herself to make, store, feed, and waste some of said hay. And it when we're talking about a commercial cow-calf operation that is pretty low margin, even in the good time, the good years, it's, a lot of times what's tipping us over into the unprofitable area is just spending excessively on input costs. When you think about all the equipment and depreciable assets that you have to purchase to facilitate the making, storing, and feeding of hay, it's the math has just never made sense for me. And so in my position at the University of Missouri, I have long explored ways to, extend the grazing season, to maybe even take a step back and ask questions about the system as a whole and how we could design a better business that integrates the utilization of forages and, beef cattle in general. So I think this topic is timely given the fact that what's interesting, we've been in drought for the last 2 years in Missouri, much of the last 2 years. And then this year we've got record-breaking rainfall across a lot of the state. And we've got bumper crops of hay. And if you, the Missouri Department of Agriculture puts a weekly market summary out, and, they consistently have been reporting soft demand for grass hay and soft prices as well. And so, I think a lot of folks are filling their barns back up after depleting them over the last couple of years. My hope is, though, that they're not building an even bigger barn to store even more hay for the next drought. So
that could be. You never know. Well, I know that some people are going to say, okay, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but how am I going to get my cows or my cattle through the winter? Because we have to have hay to get through the winter. I'm guessing you're going to tell me, well, that starts with just looking at the forage a little bit different about how we're going to have forage throughout the winter. Is that what you'd tell me?
Absolutely. And I think if you take a step back and really ask the question about how many animals can my land resource feed, what is the carrying capacity of my acreage? One of the ideas that this is probably just a little bit of a bunny trail off of what we're talking about, but I'm increasingly become convinced in these parts of the country where we feed tremendous amounts of hay in the winter for long periods of time, that perhaps we're not really truly in line with the carrying capacity of the resource base. Meaning that, in Missouri, it's pretty common for folks to say that they run 3 acres per cow. That's a common stocking rate on tall fescue based pastures. But when you're only running 3 acres for 8 and grazing for 8 months and feeding hay for 4 months, really, to get closer to a true 12-month grazing season, you're going to have to allocate some additional acreage to those cows. So I think being honest about your land base's true carrying capacity is really kind of step one of this whole deal.
So in Missouri, we have a lot of fescue. We have some bluegrass where I'm at, and those listening to us may have a different mix of forages. But how would you then begin to manage that? Stocking rate obviously is one of them, but how do I make sure that I'm going to have enough forage going into the winter? Is it just simply reducing the number of animals in that pasture?
No, so that's one big picture option, which is highly unpalatable to many producers, right? Because it's tough to make well, let's be frank, we're not making land payments based off of the revenue generated from a commercial cow calf operation in 2024. I mean, I hate to sound like the sky is falling, but that's just a fact of life. Um, you know, One other option is to run fewer cows, but then also introduce a complementary enterprise where you utilize some of that forage. So, a lot of my research is in stocker cattle systems in Missouri, trying to take advantage of utilizing that spring flush of tall fescue where, for 60 to 90 days, we have more grass than we know what to do with. And we have historically wrapped it up in, twine and net wrap as low quality forage once we get a window to actually make dry hay in the June and July range. But, I'm going back and asking the question if we shouldn't be grazing that with stocker cattle in April and May. And my research would show that we're putting, well over 1.5 pounds average daily gain on these cattle, in some cases close to 2 pounds a day with no supplement. And so, it makes sense to, rather than allocating 100% of your carrying capacity to cows, to allocate 50 to 60% of your carrying capacity to a cow calf enterprise, and then have a stocker component to take advantage of when we have that excessive growth in the spring. Most people will say that they have more grass than they know what to do with in the spring, and then the rest of the year they're kind of scrambling. Now, the reason I'm segueing into that from the original question is because what you're trying to address, Andrew, is preparing your stockpile. We'll quote unquote use the term stockpile to allow yourself to carry grazing, past the first of the year. It is absolutely possible to be grazing after New Year's Day in Missouri each year, but it takes some planning to do so. And I think step one is asking that question about carrying capacity. Step two is to, prepare those pastures in the fall with a nitrogen fertilizer. Generally, we recommend on tall fescue pastures that fertilization rate is around 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the fall for optimal stockpile development, while also deferring grazing on that land resource base so that grass can regrow. I would say one challenge that I've seen with stockpiling in recent years, and I'm not here to make any sort of wild and baseless claims about climate change or global warming or anything like that, but rainfall patterns have been less consistent in recent years, particularly for fall regrowth, because the number one driver of forage production, not just in Missouri, not just in New Mexico where I grew up, not just in any state of the country, it's precipitation. And we had a tremendous rainfall in Missouri up until about the 1st of August, and we're burning up here. I mean, in central Missouri at least. And certainly if you look at the drought monitor, we see drought developing particularly in the western third of the state, probably most concentrated in the southwestern quadrant of the state. And so, if we don't get rainfall in that will allow for this stockpile to grow, then our nitrogen fertilizer investment is either A, going to sit dormant on the land if you've got the right type of fertilizer, or B, it's going to be lost and not utilized. The general rule of thumb is that a pound of nitrogen fertilizer per acre should grow an additional 40 pounds of dry feed, of dry matter per acre. And that's if it's spring applied. If it's fall applied, it should, in a tall fescue based pasture system, grow about 20 pounds of forage per forage dry matter per acre. So one pound of nitrogen is worth 20 pounds of forage dry matter in the fall. Now, over the past couple of years, we've seen fertilizer prices spike. And when we got near to that dollar per pound of nitrogen, the math to me really was getting tight on the value of using that fall nitrogen to try and boost stockpile, especially when you factor in the probability of not getting a whole lot of growth in the fall due to a lack of precipitation. So, I kind of answered and then immediately shot down my own question, Andrew. So you want to jump back in there?
Well, I think that people sometimes wonder about, okay, is fertilizer worth it? And obviously it's going to depend on the prices and the climate and the year and so forth. In general, do you think it's better to go with fall applied than spring applied? And on crop ground, we think about doing grid sampling and so forth. We have done some grid sampling on pastures. What are your thoughts? Because you're working with all kinds of producers out there. In general, are there any recommendations?
So, for an operation that is primarily cow-calf focused, if you apply that nitrogen in the spring, you're going to more than likely be applying it just to hay ground to maximize the yield of your hay that you produce to put up for the fall. If you apply it with the intention solely of grazing it, you probably need to increase the number of animals that you've got to really effectively utilize all of that. Now, in my stocker cattle research, we generally will apply 40 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer in the spring and then turn out roughly anywhere between 1.5 5-weight animals per acre to 2.5 5-weight animals per acre, just depending on the treatment and the year and whatnot. So, there's been some discussion about deferring that nitrogen fertilizer to the fall because we have a lot of growth in the spring. We get 2/3 of our forage growth in the spring in fescue pastures, and we get 1/3 of it in the fall. And so the thought is, if you defer that 40 pounds from spring to fall, then perhaps you could provide more forage that would allow you to graze longer into the winter. So I would say that, the spring application is probably geared more towards hay fields at this point for a farm that has devoted their 100% of their carrying capacity to cows, and their pastures are probably getting nitrogen at least in the fall. Now, I would say that, phosphorus, potassium, and also soil pH are the other three, really important considerations about soil nutrient profile that we would potentially be amending with fertilizer. And, in particular, at least in Missouri, acidic soils can be a problem and can be a detriment to both the availability of nutrients in the soil, but also in terms of forage growth. And so, liming pastures is a pretty regular occurrence, at least in Missouri, to raise that pH. Now, I will say that's as far as I'm going to go because I'm not an agronomist, and we have great people at MU that can go a lot deeper into those subjects than I can as a beef nutritionist.
Right. For that grass that we may stockpile, and you mentioned going past New Year, and I will tell you in our operation as a stocker cattle operation, and while we're supplementing with feed, they're on pasture and graze January, February, unless the snow's too deep. What's the value of that fescue or other stockpiled grass there? I've seen different research, and yes, it goes down some, but Is it still a good quality forage even in the middle of the winter?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Andrew. At least in tall fescue pastures, the stockpile value of that forage. So even though we think of it as kind of a traditionally dormant season, that's vegetative forage that goes into dormancy. And so, we generally talk in terms of energy content with beef cows in terms of total digestible nutrients, or TDN, in their diet. A lactating beef cow needs a diet with TDN somewhere in the 60 to 65 range, just depending on the cow. A gestating beef cow that's not lactating, her TDN needs are probably in the 55% range. That stockpile fescue will easily clear 60% TDN in November, December, and on into January. It certainly will decline in energy value over time, but oftentimes what I run into with fall calving operations who are trying to utilize stockpile fescue, they run out of grass before the quality declines to a point where that it begins to depress calf growth, or cows start to lose body condition score. So, and I think it's important to draw a contrast, not that I want to continue to hate on hay, but very many people put grass hay up in the state of Missouri that struggles to test 50% TDN. When you get a forage that is of that energy density, the beef cow cannot eat enough of it to meet her nutrient requirements because of the limitations in terms of gut fill. And so, if her nutrient requirements are 55% TDN and your hay is 50% TDN, she'll never eat enough of it before she fills up to meet her nutrient requirements. So then you have to supplement if you want to maintain body condition score. And especially if you get into these fall calving cows, if you're trying to feed them a 50 TDN hay, a couple of pounds of supplement, and expecting them to maintain body condition score with a TDN requirement nearer to 65, you got a big gap you got to fill with supplements.
Right, right. At the top of the show, we talked briefly about the fact that in a lot of the country, we've grown a tremendous crop. So there's more corn out there than there has been before, and the price is lower. Are you getting some calls about perhaps what to do with this cheap corn that I may have a lot of?
Yeah, so there's a lot of folks that have brought up. In fact, I was just at a field day in Mount Vernon, Missouri for the Southwest Research Extension and Education Center yesterday, and I was supposed to be talking about doubling down on stockers, but I had a number of gentlemen that came up to me with questions about, hey, we've got a neighbor who's got more corn silage than they know what to do with this year. They're interested in selling. I'm interested in buying. Honestly, we could probably record a whole nother episode of this podcast just based on some recommendations for how to use that. But, I think the high level things to consider is that the shelf life of a corn silage pile, once it's cracked open, if you're going and buying corn silage, you probably ought to be buying it weekly just to maintain shelf life. You don't want to go buy a season's worth or even a month's worth, because the process of making corn silage, we're trying to exclude oxygen to prevent mold and degradation of the feed itself. And so when you're going and buying scoop bucketfuls and a truckload at a time, you're exposing a lot of feed to oxygen. So you really probably ought to be feeding it quickly. The second thing that I would tell you is that it's a wet feed. Under ideal conditions, it's probably going to be put up at 65% moisture. So 2/3 of what you're buying is water. Don't expect to haul it 200 miles and it still be a profitable feed stuff. But also don't feed your cows 30 pounds of it and expect them to perform, because, right, if you're feeding them 30 pounds of corn silage a day and nothing else, you're really feeding them 20 pounds of water and 10 pounds of dry feed, And so, there are situations where a beef cow will eat 75 pounds of corn silage a day, and that sounds like an absolutely astronomical amount of feed to offer, but you're really feeding a lot of water in that case, That's more like 50 pounds of water and 25 pounds of dry feed. So, if you don't have a lot of experience with wet feeds, I would tell you that, you need to know what the moisture content is. You need to maintain the shelf life, and then also buying it, right? So, I respect that the corn farmers need to be paid for what they're selling. But right now, if somebody tries to sell you corn silage for $120 a ton, they're probably winning on that trade quite a bit, because the old rule of thumb is that corn silage is priced roughly 10 to 12 times the bushel price of corn. And so, in the current market, that's probably somewhere in the $40 to $45 neighborhood, maybe 50. And I think a small markup on that is reasonable, but I certainly, because it's so much water that I'm buying, if I paid $80 a ton for corn silage right now, and it's only a third of that is water, if I divide 80 by 0.3, that I'm paying $240 a ton for that dry matter. That's not going to be a winning trade in this environment. Your feed cannot cost over, 10 cents a pound, and you have to feed significant amounts of it to those cows in a day.
Eric, before we wind up, I'm just curious the calls you're getting right now with cattle prices at high prices historically, and grain prices certainly off the highs that we've seen over the last few years. Has that changed the math on a lot of things we're doing in the cattle industry because we have higher cattle prices and lower feed prices?
That's a great question, Andrew. And I would have expected to get more phone calls about trying to scale up the business, right? Confinement cattle feeding. I'm sorry, confinement cow calf production, things like that. I'm really not getting a lot of those calls right now, though. I would say we've got a packing plant coming in Warren County, Missouri, that's going to be open next spring. So certainly I'm getting calls from people that are interested in backgrounding and finishing cattle here in the state. Missouri is the number 3 cow calf state in the country, and we generally feed out less than 75,000 head a year in this state, and then most of those get processed elsewhere. So, but with a larger or medium scale processing plant coming in, I'm getting a lot of questions about finishing cattle for sure. But in terms of like herd rebuilding and kind of the female side of things, I'm not really hearing a lot from folks like, oh, I'm going to keep every heifer and try to buy 100 more. I don't see the herd expansion, at least at the microeconomic scale, right? So my colleagues in ag economics, I'm sure, might have a different story, but at least boots on the ground, I'm not even really getting a lot of conversations about heifer rebuilding or heifer development, things like that. I've been going out and giving talks about heifer development in anticipation of folks being interested, but I don't know. It seems like input costs have risen just as quickly as the cattle market are, and quite frankly, we've got guys that are risking $1,500 a head to make $100 a head, and where they used to risk $800 to $900 a head. And so, from a return on investment perspective, some of these guys are getting into return on investment rates that are near to treasury bills. And so you almost wonder if they're just going to sell these cows and park their money elsewhere.
Some days you wonder if it is better to just park money else other than cattle. A cattle market is always volatile, but at least we're at higher prices right now, I guess.
Absolutely.
Right. Hey, Eric, I appreciate the time very much, and I'm sure if folks are interested in visiting with you, they can get a hold of you through University of Missouri there in the beef nutrition specialist link, so to speak, right?
Yeah. So my contact information is available on our website at extension.missouri.edu. My email is my name, Bailey Eric @missouri.edu, and my office number is 573-884-7873. I'd be glad to visit with anybody, not just in Missouri as well. And I'm going to be speaking about carrying capacity and stockers, and sort of restocking a farm after drought at NCBA in San Antonio over the winter. So it's certainly a topic of interest. I'm really glad we got to visit today, Andrew. Thank you for your time and having me on.
Yeah, great. And we'll have to catch you on the road, and hope others will as well.
All right. Sounds good.